pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1875 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. There is nothing that makes a Vietnam veteran more upset than Valor thieves. It makes me so mad I want to pierce my ears with a Black & Decker drill. Just to think that somebody like Senator Richard Blumenthal of the great state of Connecticut would lie about going to Vietnam. Before, everybody hated Vietnam veterans, called us all sorts of names. Now they're trying to get in on it by claiming they went there. Senator Blumenthal is especially slimy to me. I watched him the other day at the hearings for the proposed applicant for the Supreme Court, sitting there so high and mighty, asking her all these questions. He is a bald-faced liar himself. Apparently, valor thievery is continuing today. Hadn't slowed down any. To help illustrate the situation and to make some recommendations for you, if you know of a person you suspect of stealing valor, especially from Vietnam, I have a place where you can go and check them out. Over at the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com. Episode 1875, there will be a link there where you can go and search military records. If you can find the scoundrel's name who is pretending to be a Vietnam veteran, put it on that website and they'll tell you in just a short period of time whether or not that person is for real. Recently there was a story in the New Yorker magazine titled How to Spot a Military Imposter. The story was submitted by Rachel Monroe. I'm going to share portions of Rachel's story with you to help illustrate the problem and what you can do about it. On this very podcast, I have encountered a few valor thieves. I get very suspicious when someone claimed they served in Vietnam and the highest rank they attained was Spec 4, and they said they were graduates of Ranger School. It's very interesting. Every time that happens, I call the Ranger Committee over at Fort Benning, Georgia. When I give them the name, they check their records and they would say something like, "Never heard of him." I said, "Oh no, another valor thief." You have to be on guard all the time. Let's take a look at a part of this story. Keeping in mind, I opened up with a real big one, Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. He was of age during the war in Vietnam. He was able to wrangle 5 deferments. When he finally ran out of deferments, he pulled some strings and was able to get into a Marine Reserve unit there in Washington, D.C. That kept him from going to Vietnam, but it did not keep him from lying about going to Vietnam. With that in mind, listen to this. Dateline, New York City. Politicians lie to get us into wars. Generals lie about how well things are going. Soldiers lie about what they did during their service. In 1782, when George Washington awarded ribbons and badges to valorous Revolutionary War troops, he was already worrying about pretenders. Should any who are not entitled to these honors have the insolence to assume the badges of them, they shall be severely punished, Washington wrote. When Walter Washington Williams, thought to be the last surviving veteran of the Confederate Army, died in 1959, President Eisenhower called for a national day of mourning. It turned out that Williams had fabricated his service and that the second longest surviving Confederate soldier probably had too. In fact, according to the Civil War historian William Marvel, every one of the last dozen recognized Confederates was bogus. But it was only recently that lying about military service has been considered a particularly heinous form of lying, one with its own name, Stolen Valor. The phrase originated with B.G. Burkett, a Texas stockbroker and a Vietnam veteran whose attempts in the 1980s to raise funds for a memorial to Vietnam veterans from Texas was made difficult, he wrote, by the stereotype that soldiers who returned from the war were losers, bums, drug addicts, drunks, derelicts. Societal offal who had come back from the war plagued by nightmares and flashbacks that left them with the potential to go berserk at any moment. In 1988, Burkett read a story in the Dallas Times-Herald about Carl Dudley Williams, a homeless man who had shot and killed a police officer. The Times-Herald reported that Williams was a Vietnam veteran. One of the paper's columnists wondered whether Vietnam did that to him. On a whim, Burkett filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain Williams' military records and discovered that he had never served in Vietnam. Burkett began FOIA-ing with abandon. He requested the records of a Green Beret who signed autographs for kids at parades. Faker. He looked into the Navy SEAL and the Green Beret who operated San Antonio's Vietnam War Museum. Both liars, although each thought that the other was legit. He found that the actor, Brian Dennehy, famous for playing Rambo's law enforcement antagonist in First Blood, had lied about suffering combat wounds in Vietnam. Dennehy served 5 years in the Marines, but never in Vietnam. He apologized after Burkett went public with his accusation. Burkett caught so many people distorting or inventing their military service that he wondered whether the dissemblers might be evidence of a national phenomenon, a weird ripple in the American psyche. In 1989, Burkett was averaging one FOIA request per day. He wrote that an official at the National Archives told him that he was probably the archive's #1 individual FOIA user. In 1998, Burkett self-published Stolen Valor, How the Vietnam Generation Was Robbed of Its Heroes and Its History, which he wrote with the investigative journalist Glenna Whitley. By the way, just for your information, I highly encourage you to read this book. I read it a while back and was astounded by it. To make it easy for you to get a copy of it, all you've got to do is go over to the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com. Check out episode 1875, and there you will see a cover picture of his book and a handy link you can click on and in no time be reading it. I warn you, though, when you read it, make sure you take your blood pressure medicine because it just might drive you up the wall with anger. Continuing. The nearly 700-page book explored many of Burkett's preoccupations, that PTSD was an overdiagnosed condition cooked up by anti-war leftists, that accusations of war crimes in Vietnam were overstated. But what captured readers' attention was his exposure of military fakers. This was pre-social media, and it started going kind of viral, Whitley said. It needs to go viral. I encourage everyone, Vietnam veteran and non-Vietnam veteran, if you suspect anyone, like Senator Blumenthal, of attempting to steal Vietnam veterans' valor, go after them. An easy way to detect valor thieves is to just have a talk with them. When someone starts bragging about this or that, and he said, I was up at the DMZ with the Marines. And I say, where were you? Which firebase were you at? Were you at Con Thien? Were you out at Khe Sanh? Or maybe you were down at Marble Mountain. And once they start talking, if they're lying, it won't take long to trip them up on the truth. So please be on guard and do your best to help ferret out these valor thieves. And remember, there will be a link on the show notes for this podcast episode where you can search military records. It's quite easy. Go to this site, put a name in there, in no time, you'll get the report. Stay on the alert. If you suspect anyone of being a valor thief, check them out. Ask them questions about their service. Send their name into that website. If they prove to be a valor thief, just say it. Don't be afraid. Let them know. These people need to be exposed. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1875 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?